Hey, second to last lecture. Ooh, yeah, almost done. It's nice out, sun's shining. Every time I give one of these lectures, I see if there's more leaves on the trees. We're gonna make it. All right, Don Quixote, which is actually the very first novel that was written, so we're gonna have to talk about that, and we're gonna talk about how the novel represents a new philosophy that's rising, science. So you thought you're just reading this story about this idiot who goes out and fights against windmills, and you are reading that story. But there's actually philosophical stuff that we want to talk about here. And we're mainly going to talk about how science flips Plato's ideal upside down. This ladder's going to just go whoop upside down. All right, so here we go. You're going to actually have to learn some stuff. Now, back to Platonic idealism. Just super duper briefly, what was this concept here? Because you got to understand it before we turn it upside down. So, sensible knowledge of the physical world, the world, if you're looking around right now and you're listening to the world that I'm looking at when I'm looking out my window right now, the physical world, the world that I see through and hear, smell, whatever, through my senses, is a shadow of the ideal. And the ideal exists somewhere else. So in other words, Plato says that we perceive as reality is not reality. Or there's like a realer reality, just who knows where, someplace else. And all we see are shadows. So I'm looking out these trees right now, but those aren't really like the ideal trees. Somewhere floating around in the heavens is an ideal tree that was always going to be the perfect tree, blah, 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 blah. All right. And we can use mathematical reasoning, aka logic, to understand, to comprehend, to hold in our minds. So it's in our minds, the ideal. Can't see it, but we can hold it in our minds. That's intelligible knowledge. All right? So this implies that studying the physical world empirically through observation is a waste of time. So we should find out about the ideal through philosophy, logic, or through using faith. So Neoplatonism was how the Hebrews and then the Christians and then the Muslims took up this idea of Plato's, and we go, yeah, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. That's pure Platonic stuff, and this is from the Old Testament. The truer stuff is the stuff we don't see because faith is the route to truth. Science ain't going to lead you to truth, even though they hadn't invented it yet. Logic's not going to lead you to the truth. Plato says it will. But for the Hebrews, just believing something's true, believing in God, means that God exists. The things we do not see are the higher truths. All right, so that's where we've been all semester. People believing some sort of iteration of that. And science is going to come along and we'll flip that sucker upside down. The opposite is true from the scientific perspective. So let's get a little bit of philosophical here, okay? Science argues that we can make eternally accurate statements, right? That's the ideal, something that is eternally true. Eternally accurate statements about the nature of the physical world by combining observation and math. It's the exact opposite of what Plato argues. Science argues Plato's half right. All right. Math, we can still use math to say eternally true things, right? No one disputes that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, or that pi describes the perfect relationship in a circle. All right. So that part, science says, is accurate. But this is where science and Plato and religion differ. Here's the big schism in these two ways of looking at the world. Math accurately describes fundamental eternal truths about matter and energy, the physical world. In other words, we can use mathematical reasoning to make eternally true claims about the physical world, not about the ideal. And as it turns out, everyone always actually argues about the ideal. Plato writes about all this stuff in the Republic because he believes if we use logic, we can come up with an ideal republic, an ideal way of having government that we'll all agree on. Well, here we are, 2,500 years down the road, and nobody can agree on what the perfect ideal form of government is. And of course, the Hebrews and the Christians take this up and says, oh, if we all think rationally, then we're all going to believe that my God's the right God and your God's the wrong God. And of course, that's not true. People start having more and more religious debates the further we get into history. There's schisms within churches. But people start agreeing more and more on the nature of the physical world, so long as we describe it in using these mathematical principles. So boom, this is the moment in which we split the world into these two different ways of thinking about it. And of course, as you all know from your history classes, which since you're from Idaho, you probably didn't have to take, that the poster child for this has to do with whether or not the Earth is at the center of the universe. And of course, now we know that Earth is not at the center of the universe. The Greeks thought that it was. The Hebrews thought that it was. Everybody believes that it was for a couple thousand years, until slowly these guys start using math and observation to start figuring out that if you look at things through telescopes, and if you are able to track the movement of the planets and the stars, we start to understand through observation the opposite of what Plato thought. Plato thought we should just be able to just talk about this stuff. If we use observation in math, we can figure out that the Earth isn't even the center of the galaxy, much less the universe. And nobody disagrees about that because we can prove it through observation and math, the opposite of what Plato said would happen. Meanwhile, the reason that this is so important is because the church believed that the Greeks were right, that the Earth was the center of the universe. And this basically, why this is such a big deal, is because the church was wrong. And of course we go, yeah, well, the church may not have known how to do great math and do great astronomy, but at the time, look at these dates, at that time, the church said that it knew what the truth was. And if you disagreed with the church's version of truth, you didn't just argue about it, you were burned. Now, Galileo's not burned, but he's put under house arrest for the last few years of his life, and his books are literally damned and burned, which, if you know of your history, they weren't able to do because they recently invented the printing press, and so knowledge is able to be disseminated. Before the printing press, who is it that wrote the books? The monks. So it used to be that there was one group of people, this would be the church, and they had a stranglehold on truth, and if you disagreed with them, then you must be wrong. But science comes along and proves that that group of people were wrong. Aristotle and the church were capable of being wrong, and that's a big frickin' deal. Now, the height of this, Don Quixote's written in 1603, the height of this philosophy that we could describe the world mathematically is Newton's long Latin termed word, which we won't even try and use, all right? And so you should probably just know this as a part of your basic education, that what is science? Science says that everything can be described through the laws of physics. The physical is, in fact, the only universe that exists. That's not to say that Newton was an atheist. He wasn't. But he just decides that he's not going to take on the philosophical ramifications of this question. He's a scientist and a mathematician. The physical world is the only world, the only universe that exists. All creation, everything that exists in the entire cosmos consists of matter and the interaction of matter, which is energy. So what's matter? It's anything with mass. It's anything with physicality. Exactly the locus where Plato says you should not look for the truth. Newton's able to prove that that is the place that describes all truth. So how do we know what things have mass? Mass is anything that can be quantified. It's anything that can be measured. So what does that mean? It's quantified means counted. All right. How do we know that what world is the real world? It's the world that can be observed. How do we know what kind of observations are true? They're the ones that when we count them, we all agree. Because that goes back to Plato. We agree that the numbers don't lie. In other words, everything that exists has mass, and anything without mass, anything that had make an argument that is like pure spirit, like angels, those things don't exist. Yeah. All right. So where's the truth? Bang the table. Bang your table in front of you, right? Plato said, he used the example of a table. He says the reason you recognize a table when you see one is because there's an ideal table floating around up in the heavens. And because your soul comes down from the heavens, it has a memory of that. No. All right. We're going to say the opposite is true. We're going to say that this table in front of you is the actual table that exists, and we don't know whether or not there is a heavens because it has not been observed. It is not quantifiable. You cannot count it. But the table in front of you, we know it exists because it has mass. And how do we know it has mass? Because we can measure it. Okay, we can measure with a tape measure. We can measure its weight. And when we do that, we can all agree on the measurements. Let's just kind of go a little ahead. Periodic table of elements. Notice again that we're getting a little ahead of our game. But basically the philosophy of science says that we can break down everything into the things that exist, and we know what exists because if you look at the periodic table of elements, which I never do, I can't memorize any of these, we know what exists because each one of these things has a quantifiable number. It has a weight and it has a number of atoms. Everything that exists can be broken down into its elemental parts, and we know what those parts are because we can count them. And if you are from China and a Buddhist, or you're Russian atheist, or you are American evangelicist, you all believe that these numbers don't lie. So we could take this table and we could break down this table into its elements, what it's made out of. We could break down its elements into what those elements are made out of. We could count the atoms. We can figure out all this stuff, and we know it exists, and we will all agree, regardless of whether or not we can agree whether you should be a Republican or a Democrat. We can agree on this stuff. And that's the great scientific revolution. And that's why science is the opposite of religion. All right, so that's what it says. We're back to faith. Hebrews 11:1. There is more truer truth somewhere else, even if I can't see it or measure it. The sensory world is but a shadow, right? Things that talking about the same thing. We're all in the cave. The truer truth is either heaven or philosophy, depending on whether you're Greek or Christian. And science says that all that exists is matter and energy. Okay. So the second ontology implies that if you believe in the ideal, slow down here. If you come at the world from a completely scientific perspective, then you believe that the people that believe there are tables floating around in heaven, the people that believe in angels, those people are crazy, like Don Quixote. I'm not saying which is crazy and which is not crazy, but this is what the book is about. The people who believe in the ideal are the crazy people, and the people that confront the physical world are the sane people. So this book represents this moment in history where that philosophy has been invented. Oh yeah, other little detail. Hey, you know what? Hey, there's a whole world out there that's not described in the Bible. There's a whole world out there. I'm talking about North, South, Central America. I'm talking about Australia. I'm talking about the Antarctica, right? There was this entire planet that the Greeks didn't know existed, and they were supposed to have known everything. There's an entire planet that the Hebrews didn't know about, and they were supposed to have known everything. So this is just another great crack in society where people kind of go, wait a minute, we were always told that X was true, but the people that told us were wrong. We are not the center of the universe, and there are things they didn't know at all. Just imagine, like, you can't even freaking imagine what this must have been like. Oh my God, there's the majority of the world's population, nobody even knew it existed. Imagine that this were to happen today. You have to imagine that that would happen with science, right? Hey, we're going to send a rocket ship off to Mars, and you get all ready to go to Mars, and halfway to Mars, you bump into another planet. It's a whole different dimension that no one knew existed, and there are more people living there than on our own planet, and they are a life form that nobody had even predicted. Well, that's what happened in 1492. And by the time 1522 is when Magellan goes all the way around the world, and he just discovers more and more and more things, animals that couldn't possibly have fitted onto the ark. That's what happens in the world. Okay, so Don Quixote. What does the first novel have to do with this? Well, you got to know what a novel is, in part because it's on the test. But the novel is an extended prose work. That just means that it's a long, not poem, right? Everything, the epics that we've been reading before this were largely all written in poetry. But it's an extended prose work of realism versus fantasy or romance that focuses on the experience and the development of the protagonist, the hero, as he negotiates a realistic world. You can't invent a novel representing this idea of realism unless you believe that reality is real. Now, so you might go, well, is Harry Potter a novel? No, Harry Potter is a fantasy. Why? Because there's magic. What about The Hobbit? Is The Hobbit a novel? It's extended work of prose fiction. No, it's not. It's fantasy. Why? Because there's magic. All right. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Let's say that, that's a poem, but let's say that you were to write it in prose instead of poetry. Would that be a novel? No, because you can't cut people's heads off and have their heads grow back on. You have to believe that reality is reality in the physical sense to conceive of the novel. The same way that you need to be willing to look at the beauty of the physical body in order to construct these statues of the Renaissance. Right? So the novel represents a period of time when people believed that what reality was had completely shifted. And the way that we can differentiate between a novel and a fantasy is Don Quixote has been driven insane by reading romances, fantasies, because the ideal doesn't exist and you have to be insane to think it does, or you have to be a child. Okay, Hamlet. Note that Hamlet was performed in the same year and it's talking about the same thing. And this is because most of us have read Hamlet. It's a good way to understand how Shakespeare is working with the same idea, right? So a ghost tells Hamlet that Hamlet's uncle was killed that Hamlet's uncle killed Hamlet's father, right? So a ghost comes to you and says, I was killed by my brother and you got to go kill my brother for me, all right? So if this play were written before the scientific revolution, Hamlet would have gone, oh, when a ghost tells me something, it must be true. Because before the scientific revolution, everyone believed in ghosts. But what are ghosts? Ghosts are spirits. They're like angels. They're beings without mass. They're things we can't measure. They're the contents of our mind, our imagination. For the Hebrews, for the Christians, for Plato, that's a locus of truth. But for someone like Shakespeare, who's, 200 years into the scientific revolution, he starts to believe that, if somebody's depressed, they tend to hallucinate and things that don't actually exist. And so we cannot trust our perceptions. Now, you would think if I say you cannot trust your perceptions, then that would be pure Plato. But we can't trust our perceptions unless we can measure these things. Elsewhere in the play, Hamlet's got this really weird psychotic scene with his mother, Gertrude, and the ghost comes in and Hamlet sees the ghost, but Gertrude does not. And she says, this is the very coinage of your brain. Our imaginations, the place where intelligible knowledge exists, that cannot be trusted. The way to figure out whether there's a ghost or not is everybody should be able to see it and measure it and come up with the exact same numbers. So, Shakespeare and Cervantes are both exploring the same question. What is sanity? How does the mind accurately perceive truth? That's the question of sanity. Who is it that knows what the truth is and the truth is not? How can we trust our own perception when everything we're told turned out to be wrong? Look, you grow up with a couple thousand years of people saying that we're the center of the universe, and then a couple people prove that it's not, then everybody starts going, well, what the fuck is sanity? Who are the people I should trust? Where should I trust? What is truth? All right. Earth's not flat. People have been telling me that for years, not just for my lifetime, but for centuries. Who should I believe? Who are the crazy people and who are the sane people? Quite literally, you would have gone to church and they would have told you that men and women have different numbers of ribs, but during the scientific revolution, people start cutting open bodies and start counting the ribs. How many lies had you been told? That's what's going on in Hamlet, and that's what's going on in Don Quixote. Who are the crazy people and who are the sane people? And you think about that today, that's how we all think about each other. Those of you who are deeply religious think that the atheists are absolutely out of their minds. And those of you who are atheists think that the religious people are absolutely out of their minds. So here we are at this moment of history where that great schism happens. Sancho Panza is the opposite of Don Quixote. right? Don Quixote, he never eats. They make a big deal out of this. He's just, he doesn't eat. He doesn't drink wine. He never has sex. His life is completely devoted to moving up the ladder because the ideal sustains him. He lives in this world. He says that. He repeatedly says, all I need is to be a knight. You never read stories of knights eating food they didn't need to eat. Okay. But Sancho is happy at the bottom of the ladder, and he is the sane one. A common man may be more attached to reality because he is more attached to the physical world. The more you get into philosophy, the more you believe ideas that can't actually be proven. All right? So Sancho's down there. He's just basically feeding his mass. There is a lot of pooping involved with Sancho Panza. We don't read this part. We don't read either of these two parts. But actually, the inn that they go to, they're thrown out of the inn. But before they throw Sancho and the way they throw Sancho out is everybody, all the other characters poop onto a rug. They shit onto a rug, and then they roll Sancho up in the rug, right? He's just like, he's the very bottom of mass. There's a pun on bottom there. And then they throw the rug over the wall. And for him, throughout the next two books, this is like the moment of that he's just, I mean, think about it, being rolled up in a rug full of shit, right? It'd be the worst thing that happened to you. And that's Sancho. He's right at the very place where everybody poops. He's just a reminder that the ideal is false. We all poop. We all have mass. We all have to eat, and we all have to drink. Later in chapter 20, there's this awesome section where they hear this thumping in the woods. Thump, thump, thump. And it's the middle of the night. And Sancho is walking because his donkey's been stolen. And of course, Don Quixote's up on Roxanante. And Don Quixote's like, that's a great giant. Let's go slay the giant. And they hear this off in the woods. Thump, thump, thump. And it's super dark out. And so they're going to go slay this giant. And Sancho's just terrified. And Don Quixote's like, we're going to go slay this giant. Thump, thump. And it gets too dark. And they decide, Don Quixote's a little scared too. So they decide, let's wait. We'll wait. We'll kill the giant in the morning when we can see it. So they're sitting, so Don Quixote's sitting on his horse, and Sancho Panza's so afraid that he wraps his arms around Don Quixote's leg. It's kind of, it's kind of cute. And Sancho has to poop because he's eaten too much. He's drank too much wine, and because he's scared. And so without telling Don Quixote, he lowers his pants and he just shits right there. And the smell of it, you think about it's like the ladder, the smell, the spirit of the poop wafts its way up to Don Quixote. He's like, what the hell is that? And it's like, I'm sorry, master, I had to poop. There it is. We are all just physical beings. We're all tied to our mass. We have to eat and we have to drink. We're a human. And here is Don Quixote up on his horse, right? He's the whole idea of chivalry. He's up higher than everything else. He's just denying the reality. So think about that. There's this conversation between these two guys. What is the reality? Of course, we would all agree that of these two characters, who's the sane one and who's the crazy one? And if you want to know the answer to that, try not to poop for the rest of your life. So, insanity. He came to believe that these fictitious happenings were true. Cervantes knew reality. He fought against the Ottomans, who are the Turks, and he was shot 3 times. And for the rest of his life, he didn't have use of his left arm. He's crippled in his left arm. He can't use it. Okay. He was a prisoner and a slave during this war for 5 years. And so Don Quixote is basically this character who doesn't know what war is because Don Quixote thinks that war is what he read about in books. And Cervantes is like, you idiot, physics exists. You get shot in the arm, you're not going to just shrug it off. We watched, we've been watching lots of stupid movies where people just hit each other in the face, dozens and dozens. Oh, Extraction, right? Here's this guy, he's just getting shot at by 200 different people. Hey, that's the world of video games. Somebody who's actually been through combat is going to say, that's actually not what combat's like. What I've heard that combat is like is that combat is the smell of shit because people are shitting their pants and because they are being shot in the stomach. There's the part where Don Quixote comes across in the very first books that we read that Don Quixote comes across this guy, this farmer who's whipping his servant, Andres. And Don Quixote says, oh, you should treat each other well, and you should pay Andres this money that he owes, and blah 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 that you owe him. And then as soon as Don Quixote leaves, the master whips Andres even harder, right? Don Quixote has this ideal of the republic that's just false. People are poopers. Don Quixote actually breaks his bones. He's living in this fictitious world and he keeps breaking things. I don't think we read, maybe, did you guys read this? I can't remember. He sees a flock of sheep and he thinks that they're an army, and he goes and he just kills all these sheep. All these little baby sheep have to die. Grisostomo. Grisostomo is the student who, in order to chase the beautiful Marcella, he dresses up as a shepherd because she's dressed up as a shepherd. And he goes off, and by chasing the ideal, the most beautiful woman that exists, it kills him. To chase the ideal is a form of insanity, and if you chase it too hard, it will kill you. So Grisostomo is Don Quixote, somebody who dresses up. He's like wearing his furry outfit or whatever. All right. Dresses up to pretend he's something that he's not, because he's trying to achieve the ideal, and it just gets your butt kicked. And for Grisostomo, it gets you killed. We're going to come back and talk a whole bunch more about Marcella, so we're not letting go of this section. Okay. Ironically, Plato sort of was into this idea that reading too much fiction was going to rot your mind. And so in the Republic, which is where we get the allegory of the cave, Plato actually argues, he's talking about Homer, that all poets should be banned from the ideal republic. And why? It's because Homer's so good that he paints this picture of reality that is clearly not real, and that we all drink that Kool-Aid. And so how are we going to have a good form of government in which we have to make good choices, because it's a democracy? And if everybody has been drinking the Kool-Aid and everybody can't tell fact from fiction, they're all going to make stupid choices. So, obviously, we don't want to get rid of all the poets. We don't want to get rid of all the storytellers. But he's kind of got a point, right? That if you grow up reading romances, if you grow up reading Harry Potter and you grew up reading Disney, you don't really have a good sense of what reality is. We could talk about this in terms of like vegetarianism. People that grow up in cities, almost all of our exposure to animals are either that all animals are our pets or all animals are animals that we saw on the television. And I don't know about you guys, but I grew up watching cartoons, and we watched all these cartoons in which the animals were sentient. They speak, right? Bambi speaks to rabbits and skunks, and he's able to philosophize about the nature of life. Yeah, that's a nice little ideal, Disney, but it's not the real world. So for those of you guys who took the Love and Happiness class, you know that's what that class is all about, is we're all drinking Kool-Aid. All right? Too much video gaming, you're not going to have a sense about what war is really like. So when there really are wars, you might support those wars because you assume that those wars are like your video games. If you get all your news from somebody who's trying to tell you an ideal, you don't really know what's going on in the real world. All right? So Cervantes seems to agree that too much Fox News, too much Disney, too much Homer is going to rot your little brain. And that's what this book is about. But that's only half the story. All right? So part of this is just purely a treatise on science and how the people who don't think scientifically are crazy. But then the genius of the guy who comes up with the first novel, he's also going to write the first postmodern novel. So when we come back on Friday, we'll learn about how the author of the first novel then inverted everything that he just invented, right? He just inverted everything. Now he's going to invert it back, and he's going to write the first postmodern novel. And everything that I just told you, this same novel is also going to prove is untrue. Yeah, that's pretty good, right? So I'm going to completely undo this entire lecture on Friday, because that's why this book is the work of a genius. He creates a whole new art form, and then he's going to critique that art form and flip it upside down again. Oh, it's so awesome. All right. Now, we shall go outside, because I have absolutely no idea whether this fallen world is the ideal world or it's just a shadow. But man, it's beautiful. All right. Hope you guys are all well. And you're really close. You're really close to finishing up. Just hang in there. You got it. We're going to do it. All right. Take care.